Long before tobacco became a subject of public warning labels and legal scrutiny, it stood at the center of American industry. In an era defined by expansion, mechanization, and mass consumption, cigarettes were produced not as luxury goods, but as standardized products designed for scale. Few companies understood this shift better than the Reynolds Tobacco Company. Its influence extended beyond the products it sold, reaching into transportation networks, advertising practices, and the economic foundations of entire communities. At the heart of that influence stood a factory system built to operate continuously, efficiently, and at a size rarely matched by its competitors. This system did not simply manufacture cigarettes, it organized labor, controlled supply chains, and reshaped the relationship between agriculture and industry. Over time, its output would help elevate a single brand to national prominence and bind the fate of a growing city to the rhythms of production. Yet the same forces that allowed the factory to thrive would eventually expose its limits, as scientific knowledge, public pressure, and economic change altered the landscape in which it once dominated. This documentary examines how one tobacco factory became a pillar of American industrial power, how it sustained that power for decades, and what its presence ultimately left behind when the machines fell silent. Chapter 1. R.J. Reynolds. The man behind the company, Richard Joshua Reynolds, was not born into power or prestige. He entered the world in 1850 in a country still defined by agriculture, regional trade, and small-scale enterprise. The United States of his youth was expanding rapidly, but it was not yet industrialized in the modern sense. Most goods were produced locally, businesses were family-run, and national brands were rare. Reynolds grew up observing this environment closely. He learned early that success did not come from novelty alone, but from understanding how products moved, how markets behaved, and how scale could turn ordinary goods into lasting businesses. By the late 19th century, America was changing quickly. Railroads were stitching regions together, cities were growing, and consumer demand was becoming more uniform across states. This shift created opportunities for individuals who could think beyond local markets. Reynolds was one of them. Rather than approaching business as a craftsman or inventor, he approached it as a strategist. He paid attention to patterns, where demand was rising, where supply was fragmented, and where inefficiencies created room for growth. Tobacco, at the time, was already widely consumed, but it remained inconsistent in quality and distribution. Products varied by region, branding was limited, and production lacked standardization. To Reynolds, this was not a mature industry, but an unfinished one. He did not see tobacco as a product that needed reinvention. Instead, he saw an industry that needed structure. Where others focused on blending techniques or local reputation, Reynolds focused on scale. He believed that the future of tobacco lay in making the same product available everywhere, reliably and in large quantities. This perspective shaped his early business philosophy. Reynolds understood that controlling distribution was just as important as controlling the product itself. In an era when transportation was becoming faster and cheaper, the ability to move goods efficiently could determine success or failure. He recognized that national reach would matter more than regional dominance, and that consistency would matter more than complexity. Rather than investing heavily in experimentation with flavor or presentation, he invested in systems that could support growth. Reynolds also operated with a clear understanding of consumer behavior. He believed that most customers valued familiarity and availability over refinement. In his view, a product that could be found everywhere, priced competitively, and delivered consistently would outperform one that relied on distinction or exclusivity. This belief guided his decisions from the beginning. He did not attempt to redefine taste. He aimed to meet demand at scale, trusting that volume and visibility would create loyalty over time. The broader economic environment reinforced this approach. The late 19th century rewarded businesses that could expand rapidly and operate efficiently. Industries such as steel, oil, and rail transport were demonstrating that scale itself was a competitive advantage. Reynolds applied the same logic to tobacco. He positioned himself not as an artisan, but as an organizer, someone focused on coordination, logistics, and long-term growth. What set Reynolds apart from many of his contemporaries was discipline. He avoided unnecessary diversification and remained focused on execution. He understood that early success could easily be undone by overreach, and he preferred steady expansion over speculative risk. His decisions reflected patience rather than ambition for its own sake. Each move was calculated, designed to strengthen distribution, stabilize supply, and increase output without sacrificing consistency. By the end of the 19th century, Reynolds had established himself as a businessman, shaped by the realities of industrial America. He was not driven by invention or personal legacy, but by the belief that industries could be organized more efficiently than they currently were. His approach to tobacco was grounded in observation, timing, and scale. The foundations he laid during this period were not about buildings or brands, but about systems that would later define the company bearing his name. Understanding R.J. Reynolds requires understanding what he was not. He was not a visionary in the romantic sense, nor a pioneer of new tastes. He was a product of his time, shaped by a nation learning how to produce and distribute goods on a massive scale. His lasting influence came from recognizing that the future of business belonged to those who could think nationally, operate efficiently, and turn ordinary products into standardized commodities. That mindset would guide everything that followed. Chapter 2. Why Winston-Salem became the factory's home. The decision to locate a major tobacco operation in Winston-Salem was not the result of symbolism or tradition. It was a practical choice shaped by geography, resources, and the economic realities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. At that time, North Carolina stood at the center of the American tobacco economy. The state produced vast quantities of leaf tobacco, supported by a long-established agricultural base and favorable growing conditions. For companies operating at scale, proximity to this raw material was not a preference. It was a necessity. Transporting tobacco over long distances added cost, risk, and delay, all of which could undermine consistency and profitability. Winston-Salem sat within this broader tobacco-growing region and offered a strategic advantage that went beyond agriculture alone. Its location placed it within reach of multiple supply routes, allowing raw materials to be gathered efficiently and finished goods to be distributed outward. As railroads expanded across the southeastern United States, Winston-Salem became increasingly connected to national transportation networks. Rail access reduced reliance on slower, less predictable methods of transport and allowed companies to think in terms of regional and national distribution rather than local trade. Equally important was the availability of labor. The surrounding region provided a steady workforce, familiar with tobacco as a crop and as a commercial product. This reduced the need for extensive retraining and allowed operations to scale more quickly. Labor costs in the area were also lower than in major northern industrial centers, giving companies a competitive advantage without sacrificing reliability. For business leaders focused on efficiency, these conditions mattered more than prestige or visibility. The choice of Winston-Salem also reflected a shift in how tobacco businesses were structured. Earlier operations often relied on smaller workshops or dispersed facilities that handled limited volumes. That model worked when markets were local and output was modest. By the turn of the century, demand patterns had changed. National distribution required larger, centralized operations capable of handling consistent volumes. Building a large facility in a location that could support it was a logical response to those pressures. This approach allowed companies to bring multiple stages of their supply chain into closer coordination. Tobacco could be sourced, stored, and prepared within a tightly managed system, reducing waste and uncertainty. While the details of production varied over time, the underlying principle remained the same. Efficiency improved when supply chains were shortened and controlled. Winston-Salem provided the space, infrastructure, and access needed to support this integrated model. Transportation played a central role in reinforcing this decision. Rail lines linked the region to major markets along the East Coast and beyond, making it possible to move goods quickly and predictably. This connectivity lowered distribution costs and allowed companies to respond more rapidly to changes in demand. In an industry where timing and availability were critical, reliable transport could determine long-term success. Another factor was the local business environment. North Carolina actively supported tobacco-related enterprise through favorable policies and a regulatory climate that encouraged growth. This stability reduced uncertainty for large investments and made long-term planning more feasible. Companies could commit resources with greater confidence that conditions would remain supportive over time. Taken together, these elements explain why Winston-Salem emerged as a logical base of operations. It was close to raw materials, connected to transportation networks, supported by available labor, and aligned with a broader shift toward large-scale industrial organization. The location did not define the company's ambitions, but it enabled them. By anchoring operations in a place that supported efficiency and expansion, the foundation was laid for sustained growth within a competitive national market. The choice of Winston-Salem was ultimately about control over supply, movement, and cost. It reflected a broader trend in American industry, where success increasingly depended on strategic location and infrastructure rather than tradition. This decision would shape everything that followed, not through symbolism, but through the quiet logic of economics and logistics. Chapter 3. How the Tobacco Factory Operated. The tobacco factory operated as a controlled industrial system designed for consistency, speed, and scale. Every stage of work followed a defined sequence, and each step was structured to reduce variation. The process began with the arrival of leaf tobacco, which entered the facility in large quantities according to scheduled deliveries. Once received, the material was sorted and prepared to meet uniform standards. This initial handling was essential, as the quality and condition of the raw leaf determined how smoothly the rest of the operation could proceed. After intake, tobacco moved through a series of processing stages intended to stabilize and prepare it for manufacturing. Moisture levels were adjusted, and the leaves were conditioned to ensure they could be handled mechanically without breaking or clumping. These steps were not experimental or improvised. They followed established procedures refined over time to support uninterrupted production. Any deviation risked slowing the entire system, so control and predictability were prioritized at every point. Cutting represented a critical transition from raw material to standardized input. Leaves were reduced into consistent sizes that could be fed reliably into machines. Precision mattered more than speed at this stage, because uniform cuts ensured that later steps could operate continuously. Once prepared, the tobacco flowed into rolling mechanisms designed to produce identical units at high volume. These machines transformed loose material into finished form with minimal variation, reflecting the factory's emphasis on sameness rather than customization. Packaging followed immediately after rolling, completing the operational cycle. Finished units were counted, wrapped, and boxed according to preset quantities. This stage was tightly synchronized with earlier steps, preventing bottlenecks or excess accumulation. The goal was not merely to complete individual tasks, but to maintain balance across the entire operation. Each department functioned as part of a single system rather than as an independent unit. Mechanization played an increasingly central role in this environment. While manual labor remained present, machines dictated the pace of work. Equipment was designed to run continuously, and human activity was organized around keeping those machines operating without interruption. Maintenance, supervision, and scheduling all served the same purpose: minimizing downtime. This reliance on machinery allowed output to reach levels that smaller operations could not match. Industrial discipline defined daily operations. Time was measured precisely, tasks were standardized, and procedures were documented and enforced. Workers were expected to follow established routines rather than rely on personal judgment. This structure reduced errors and ensured that output remained consistent regardless of individual differences. The system valued reliability over flexibility, reflecting the broader priorities of large-scale manufacturing. Mass production was the defining principle behind the factory's design. Instead of adapting production to changing conditions, conditions were shaped to fit production. Materials arrived according to fixed schedules, machines operated at predetermined speeds, and finished goods moved out in steady volumes. This approach reduced costs per unit and allowed planning at a scale that smaller facilities could not achieve. Standardization extended beyond machinery to management practices. Measurements, inspections, and internal controls were applied uniformly across operations. Decisions were based on efficiency metrics rather than craft or tradition. The objective was not to produce unique goods, but to produce the same goods repeatedly, with minimal variation from one batch to the next. The factory functioned as a closed loop of movement and control. Raw materials entered, passed through a defined sequence, and exited as finished output without unnecessary delay. Every element of the system reinforced the others, creating an environment where predictability was more valuable than innovation. This operational model reflected a broader shift in American industry, where success increasingly depended on organization, scale, and the ability to manage complexity through standard systems. Understanding how the factory operated means understanding its priorities. It was built to produce volume, not variety. It rewarded consistency, not experimentation. And it treated production as an engineering problem rather than a craft. This operational philosophy shaped everything that happened within its walls and set the foundation for the role the factory would play in the decades that followed. Chapter 4: The Rise of Camel Cigarettes. In 1913, R.J. Reynolds introduced a cigarette that would fundamentally change the American tobacco market. The product was called Camel, and its launch marked a turning point in how cigarettes were made, sold, and recognized by the public. At a time when many tobacco products were still associated with regional brands or loose tobacco, Camel was designed from the beginning to operate at a national level. It was not simply a new name on the market. It represented a different way of thinking about consumer goods. One of the most important aspects of Camel's introduction was its composition. Instead of relying on a single regional style, the cigarette combined different types of tobacco into a blended product that appealed to a broader audience. This approach reduced dependence on local preferences and made the product more adaptable to nationwide distribution. The goal was consistency, ensuring that customers encountered the same product regardless of where it was purchased. This was a departure from earlier tobacco offerings, which often varied in character and quality from place to place. Equally significant was the way Camel was presented to the public. R.J. Reynolds approached marketing not as a secondary function, but as a central pillar of the product's success. Rather than targeting a narrow audience, the company focused on mass communication. Advertising campaigns were designed to reach large numbers of consumers quickly and repeatedly. Print media, signage, and coordinated promotional efforts created familiarity before many customers had even tried the product. This strategy emphasized recognition and curiosity, laying the groundwork for rapid adoption. The branding of Camel was intentionally straightforward and memorable. The name, imagery, and messaging were easy to identify and difficult to confuse with competitors. At a time when packaging often lacked distinction, Camel stood out through clarity rather than complexity. The brand did not rely on exclusivity or craftsmanship. Instead, it presented itself as modern, accessible, and widely available. This positioning aligned closely with changing consumer habits in early 20th century America, where convenience and familiarity were becoming increasingly important. Another factor in Camel's rise was timing. By the early 1910s, cigarettes were gaining acceptance as a mainstream product rather than a niche alternative to other forms of tobacco. R.J. Reynolds recognized this shift and moved decisively. Instead of treating cigarettes as a secondary offering, the company placed Camel at the center of its portfolio. Resources were concentrated on expanding its reach, refining its presentation, and ensuring steady availability across markets. This focus allowed Camel to grow quickly without being diluted by competing priorities. Distribution strategy reinforced the brand's momentum. Camel was positioned to be easy to find, consistently priced, and reliably supplied. This removed barriers to repeat purchases and helped establish habitual demand. The product's success did not depend on rarity or novelty. It depended on presence. Over time, Camel became a familiar option for consumers who valued predictability and convenience, qualities that aligned well with mass market appeal. As sales increased, Camel transitioned from a successful product into the company's primary offering. Its performance shaped broader business decisions, influencing how resources were allocated and how future strategies were developed. The brand's dominance was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate choices about scale, messaging, and market coverage. Camel demonstrated that in a national marketplace, a well-managed brand could outperform a collection of smaller, disconnected products. By establishing Camel as a flagship brand, R.J. Reynolds confirmed the effectiveness of its broader approach to business. The company did not depend on constant reinvention. Instead, it relied on consistency, visibility, and reach. Camel's rise illustrated how a single product, when aligned with mass marketing and distribution, could define an entire company's direction. The introduction of Camel in 1913 was therefore more than a product launch. It was a demonstration of how tobacco could be packaged, promoted, and scaled for a modern consumer economy. Its success reshaped the competitive landscape and set a new standard for what a national cigarette brand could achieve. Chapter 5. The Factory and the Growth of Camel City. As the tobacco operation expanded, its presence began to shape Winston-Salem in ways that extended far beyond the company itself. What started as a single industrial anchor gradually became the organizing force around which the city grew. Streets, neighborhoods, and commercial districts developed in response to the steady pull of employment and investment connected to the factory. Over time, the rhythm of the city aligned closely with the demands of a business that operated at a scale few others could match. Employment was the most visible link between the factory and the community. Thousands of residents relied on it directly or indirectly for their livelihoods. Wages earned within its walls circulated outward, supporting local merchants, service providers, and small businesses. This flow of income created stability and encouraged population growth, drawing families to the area in search of steady work. As more people arrived, the city expanded to accommodate them. Housing development followed this growth. Residential areas were built within practical distance of the factory, allowing workers and their families to settle nearby. These neighborhoods were not planned as temporary solutions, but as long-term communities. Schools, churches, and local institutions emerged alongside them, reinforcing the sense that the city's future was closely tied to the continued presence of the tobacco business. Infrastructure investment reflected this relationship as well. Roads were improved to handle increased traffic, utilities expanded to meet rising demand, and public services grew in scale and capacity. The needs of a large industrial employer accelerated changes that might otherwise have taken decades. In this way, the factory acted as a catalyst, speeding up Winston-Salem's transition from a modest town into a more complex urban center. As the company's products gained national recognition, that visibility fed back into the city's identity. Winston-Salem became widely associated with tobacco, and over time it earned the nickname Camel City. The label was not the result of an official campaign but of public perception. It reflected how closely the city's name had become linked with a single brand and the industry behind it. For many outsiders, the two were inseparable. This identity carried both pride and responsibility. On one hand, the factory's success placed Winston-Salem on the national map. It signaled economic strength and industrial relevance at a time when many southern cities struggled to attract large-scale investment. On the other hand, it deepened the city's reliance on a single economic engine. Decisions made within the company had the potential to affect thousands of lives beyond its boundaries. Local businesses adapted to this reality. Retailers, transportation services, and suppliers aligned their operations with the needs of the tobacco industry. Entire segments of the local economy became dependent on the stability and continued expansion of the factory. This interdependence reinforced growth but also concentrated risk, tying the city's fortunes closely to those of the company. Civic leadership was shaped by this relationship as well. Planning decisions often took into account the requirements of a dominant employer, whether through zoning, infrastructure priorities, or economic development strategies. The factory's presence influenced how resources were allocated and how the city imagined its future. Growth was not random. It followed the contours set by industrial demand. Over time, Winston-Salem became an example of how a single enterprise could define a place. The factory did not merely operate within the city. It helped structure the city's economy, geography, and reputation. The nickname Camel City captured this reality in simple terms. It acknowledged that the city's rise was inseparable from the rise of the tobacco business that anchored it. This chapter of Winston-Salem's history illustrates a broader pattern in American industrial development. When a large employer takes root, it does more than create jobs. It shapes how a city grows, how people settle, and how a community understands itself. In Winston-Salem, the factory stood at the center of that process, leaving an imprint that would last for generations. Chapter 6: Health Science and Growing Challenges. For much of the early 20th century, tobacco existed largely beyond scientific scrutiny. Its widespread use was accepted as a normal part of daily life, and serious medical examination remained limited. That situation began to change gradually as the field of public health expanded and research methods became more systematic. By the middle of the century, scientists and physicians were increasingly focused on understanding how everyday habits affected long-term health. Tobacco, once overlooked, became a subject of sustained investigation. Early medical studies did not arrive all at once or with immediate consensus. Instead, evidence accumulated over time. Researchers began to observe patterns linking smoking to specific illnesses, drawing on population studies, clinical observations, and emerging statistical techniques. These findings challenged long-held assumptions and introduced uncertainty into an industry that had previously operated with little public questioning. What made these studies influential was not a single discovery, but the growing consistency of results across different institutions and countries. As scientific conclusions reached broader audiences, public awareness began to shift. Reports circulated through newspapers, journals, and eventually government briefings, translating complex data into accessible language. For For the first time, many consumers were confronted with information suggesting that tobacco use carried measurable risks. This did not lead to immediate behavioral change, but it altered the context in which tobacco products were viewed. Consumption was no longer framed solely as a personal preference. It became a topic of public discussion. Public opinion evolved unevenly. Some dismissed the findings as inconclusive or exaggerated, while others viewed them as a serious warning. This divide created a new environment for tobacco companies, one defined by scrutiny rather than acceptance. Questions that had once been peripheral, about responsibility, disclosure, and safety, moved closer to the center of public debate. The industry found itself responding not only to market forces, but to social pressure shaped by scientific authority. Media coverage amplified these challenges. Scientific studies were summarized, debated, and sometimes contested in widely read publications. As coverage expanded, the conversation reached beyond medical circles and entered everyday discourse. This exposure increased pressure on tobacco brands whose images had been built around familiarity and trust. Maintaining a positive public perception became more difficult as the association between smoking and health concerns gained visibility. Regulatory attention followed public concern. Government agencies began to review scientific evidence and consider how it should inform policy. While early responses were cautious, the direction was clear. Tobacco would no longer operate in a regulatory vacuum. Even before formal rules were implemented, the possibility of oversight introduced uncertainty. Companies had to anticipate changing expectations and prepare for an environment in which claims and practices could be questioned. These developments posed a direct challenge to brand identity. Tobacco companies had long relied on stability and continuity, presenting their products as dependable and unchanged. Scientific criticism disrupted that narrative. Brands now faced the task of maintaining consumer confidence in a climate where doubt was increasingly visible. The challenge was not limited to compliance or communication. It extended to how products were perceived at a cultural level. Internally, these pressures required careful assessment. Scientific findings could not be ignored, yet responses had to be measured to avoid drawing further attention. Navigating this balance became an ongoing concern. The industry was forced to operate in parallel worlds, one defined by established business practices and another shaped by emerging scientific critique. Managing that tension became a defining feature of the period. By the latter half of the 20th century, the relationship between tobacco and science had fundamentally changed. What began as isolated research had grown into a sustained challenge backed by institutions and data. Public trust, once assumed, now had to be actively maintained. The industry's position was no longer uncontested, and its future would increasingly be shaped by forces outside its direct control. This chapter marks a shift from certainty to question. Scientific research did not immediately dismantle the tobacco industry, but it altered the conditions under which it operated. The rise of health science introduced scrutiny, debate, and pressure that would continue to intensify. Tobacco was no longer just a product in the marketplace. It had become a subject of examination, and that change would have lasting consequences for everything that followed. Chapter 7: An Industry Under Pressure. By the late 20th century, the tobacco industry was operating in an environment that differed sharply from the one that had supported its earlier growth. External pressures accumulated across multiple fronts, forcing companies to adapt to conditions that were increasingly complex and restrictive. What had once been a relatively stable business now faced constant adjustment as legal, economic, and cultural factors reshaped the market. One of the most significant changes came through law and regulation. Governments at the federal and state levels began to introduce tighter rules governing tobacco sales, labeling, and promotion. Taxes on tobacco products rose steadily, increasing retail prices and narrowing profit margins. These measures were often justified as tools to reduce consumption and recover public costs. But for the industry, they represented a sustained financial and operational challenge. Planning became more difficult as regulatory requirements expanded and varied by jurisdiction. Advertising restrictions added another layer of pressure. Opportunities to promote tobacco products through traditional channels were reduced or eliminated, limiting the ability of companies to communicate directly with consumers. Where advertising had once been a central driver of growth, it now became a constrained activity subject to oversight and limitation. Brands were forced to operate with less visibility, relying on established recognition rather than aggressive outreach. This shift favored incumbents but reduced flexibility across the market. At the same time, consumer behavior was changing. Smoking rates began to decline in many segments of the population, particularly among younger consumers. Social attitudes evolved, and tobacco use became less common in public spaces and professional environments. These changes did not occur overnight, but their cumulative effect was significant. Demand patterns grew less predictable, and long-term growth assumptions had to be revised. Economic pressure extended beyond sales figures. The cost of doing business increased steadily. Compliance with new regulations required additional administrative oversight and legal support. Tax increases affected pricing strategies, while shifts in distribution demanded greater coordination. Each adjustment added complexity, raising the baseline cost of operation, even as overall demand softened. These pressures exposed the limitations of older industrial infrastructure. Facilities designed for an earlier era were optimized for volume and consistency, not adaptability. As market conditions changed, modifying large, centralized operations became more difficult. Fixed layouts, long-established workflows, and legacy equipment limited how quickly companies could respond to new requirements. Flexibility, once secondary to scale, became increasingly important. Operational rigidity translated into financial strain. Maintaining large facilities required continuous investment, regardless of fluctuations in demand. Energy costs, maintenance, and compliance expenses rose, while opportunities to offset them through growth diminished. The economic logic that had once supported large-scale production began to erode under the weight of higher costs and reduced margins. Strategic planning shifted accordingly. Instead of focusing primarily on expansion, companies devoted more attention to efficiency and risk management. Cost control became a priority, and decisions were evaluated through a more cautious lens. The industry moved from an era of confidence to one of calculation, where long-term assumptions were tested against a changing regulatory and consumer landscape. Competition within the industry also intensified. As overall consumption declined, companies competed more aggressively for market share. Price sensitivity increased, and small changes in cost or distribution could have outsized effects. The environment rewarded careful management, but penalized inflexibility. Those unable to adapt faced growing disadvantage. By this stage, the tobacco industry was no longer defined by growth alone. It was defined by constraint, legal oversight, taxation, advertising limits, and shifting consumer behavior combined to create sustained pressure. The business remained profitable, but its trajectory had changed. Success depended less on expansion and more on navigating a narrowing path shaped by external forces. This period marked a transition. The industry was still operating, still producing, and still reaching consumers. But the conditions that had once made large-scale tobacco production straightforward were gone. What remained was a complex balance between regulation, cost, and demand, a balance that would continue to influence decisions in the years ahead. Chapter 8: The Decline of Factory-Based Production. As the tobacco industry moved deeper into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the logic that had once supported massive, centralized factory production began to break down. The shift was gradual rather than abrupt, driven by structural changes in how companies organized manufacturing, managed costs, and responded to a more demanding regulatory and economic environment. The historic factory model, once a symbol of efficiency and power, increasingly appeared out of step with modern industrial needs. One of the central forces behind this change was the relocation of production. Advances in transportation, logistics, and supply chain management made it less necessary to concentrate manufacturing in a single, long-established location. Companies began to favor facilities that could be built or adapted with greater flexibility, often closer to specific supply routes or distribution hubs. Production was redistributed rather than expanded, allowing firms to reduce reliance on aging complexes that were expensive to maintain and difficult to modify. Corporate restructuring reinforced this trend. As tobacco companies reevaluated their organizational structures, manufacturing was treated as one component of a broader global strategy rather than a fixed local operation. Management emphasized efficiency, cost control, and scalability. This often meant consolidating operations, streamlining production lines, and reallocating resources to facilities better suited to contemporary standards. Decisions were guided less by tradition and more by performance metrics and long-term financial planning. Large historic factories faced inherent limitations under these new priorities. Their size, once an advantage, became a constraint. Built to handle enormous volumes under stable market conditions, they lacked the adaptability required for fluctuating demand and evolving regulations. Retrofitting older buildings to meet updated safety, environmental, and operational requirements required substantial investment with no guarantee of proportional returns. In many cases, smaller or purpose-built facilities offered a more practical alternative. The internal organization of these factories also posed challenges. Production layouts had been designed around older manufacturing technologies, with fixed workflows and specialized spaces that were not easily reconfigured. Introducing new equipment or altering production methods often required extensive structural changes. This rigidity limited experimentation and slowed response times, placing historic factories at a disadvantage compared to newer operations designed with modularity in mind. As production shifted, the physical infrastructure of the factories began to change. Entire production lines were taken offline as output was reassigned elsewhere. Machinery that had once operated continuously was shut down, dismantled, or removed. These decisions were not symbolic but operational, reflecting the reduced role of the factory within the company's manufacturing network. The process unfolded in stages, as lines were evaluated individually based on cost, efficiency, and relevance. This dismantling marked a clear departure from earlier eras of industrial confidence. Instead of expansion and modernization within the same walls, companies chose redistribution and reorganization. Capital investment flowed toward facilities that aligned more closely with current production models, while older plants gradually lost their central function. The shift reflected a broader change in industrial thinking, where flexibility and cost efficiency outweighed scale and permanence. Economic considerations remained central throughout this transition. Maintaining large factories required continuous spending on utilities, maintenance, and compliance, regardless of output levels. As production volumes declined or became uneven, these fixed costs became harder to justify. Relocating or consolidating production allowed companies to align expenses more closely with actual demand, improving financial predictability. By this stage, factory-based production was no longer disappearing because of a single event or decision. It was receding as part of a systematic reconfiguration of how tobacco companies operated. Manufacturing moved away from historic sites not out of neglect, but as a calculated response to changing conditions. The factories that had once defined the industry's physical presence were gradually removed from the center of production strategy. This decline marked the end of an industrial model built for a different era. What replaced it was not absence, but redistribution. Production spread across locations designed for efficiency rather than legacy. The historic factory, once essential, became increasingly peripheral as the industry adapted to a new operational reality. Chapter 9. When the machines fell silent. When tobacco production finally stopped at the historic R.J. Reynolds complex, the change was immediate but uneven. The machinery fell silent, schedules disappeared, and buildings that had once operated around the clock no longer served their original purpose. Yet the site did not collapse into instant ruin. Instead, it entered a prolonged period of uncertainty. No longer industrial, but not yet something new. Some structures stood largely unused, their interiors emptied of equipment and activity. Conveyor systems were removed, floors cleared, and utilities scaled back. These spaces appeared dormant rather than abandoned, preserved by ownership but stripped of function. The absence of daily operations altered the physical atmosphere of the complex. Without constant movement, the buildings revealed their age. Brickwork weathered, windows darkened, and long corridors echoed with stillness. The human impact of this transition was felt beyond the walls themselves. For those whose livelihoods had been tied to the site, the end of production marked a break in routine and identity. Skills developed over decades were no longer needed in the same form. Some workers adapted by moving into other industries or roles, while others faced displacement in a regional economy, adjusting to a different future. The factory's silence represented not just an economic shift, but the closing of a chapter in working life that had once defined stability and continuity. As industrial use faded, the sheer scale of the complex posed a new question. What could be done with so much built space? The buildings had been designed for efficiency, durability, and long-term use. Thick walls, high ceilings, and wide floor plates made demolition costly and impractical. At the same time, their central location and architectural character made them difficult to ignore. What had once been an asset for manufacturing now became a challenge for planners, owners, and developers. In the early years after production ended, change came slowly. Portions of the site remained inactive while feasibility studies and proposals circulated. The process was cautious, shaped by economic conditions, zoning considerations, and the need to balance preservation with reinvention. Rather than a single decisive transformation, redevelopment unfolded in phases, guided by experimentation and gradual investment. Over time, former industrial spaces began to attract new forms of activity. Offices, research facilities, and commercial uses replaced conveyor belts and storage rooms. Original structural elements were retained where possible, allowing the past to remain visible, even as interiors were adapted for modern needs. This approach reflected a broader shift in how large industrial sites were treated across the United States, not as relics to be erased, but as frameworks capable of supporting new purposes. The transformation of the R.J. Reynolds complex did not erase the memory of its earlier role. Instead, it layered new functions onto existing foundations. The buildings continued to shape daily life, no longer through production schedules and shipments, but through meetings, innovation, and public use. The factory did not vanish. It changed form. By the time redevelopment gained momentum, the site had moved beyond its period of inactivity. What followed was not a return to its industrial past, but a redefinition of what such a place could be. The silence that once marked the end of manufacturing became the space in which a different future was built, one that acknowledged the site's history without being bound to it. Chapter 10. Legacy, Meaning, and Lessons. The story of the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Complex does not end with the final cigarette produced or the last machine powered down. Its true legacy lies in what it represented for American industry during a defining period of national growth. For decades, the site stood as a physical expression of scale, coordination, and industrial confidence. It demonstrated how a single operation, when organized around efficiency and reach, could shape markets far beyond its immediate surroundings. At its core, the factory embodied the logic of mass production that defined modern America. Raw agricultural materials were transformed into standardized consumer goods at a volume that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. This model reflected a broader shift in the American economy, away from regional craft and toward national systems built on consistency, speed, and distribution. In that sense, the tobacco factory was not an exception, but a representative example of how industry evolved at the turn of the 20th century. The company's success also offered a lesson in branding. Long before corporate identity became a specialized discipline, R.J. Reynolds understood that recognition and familiarity mattered as much as the product itself. By focusing on national reach and uniform presentation, the company helped define how brands could become cultural fixtures. This approach influenced not only competitors within the tobacco industry, but American consumer culture as a whole. The factory supported this strategy by delivering reliability at scale, reinforcing the connection between production capacity and brand dominance. At the same time, the history of the site reveals the risks of economic concentration. As production expanded, entire local systems became tied to the fortunes of a single industry. When conditions changed, through regulation, public opinion, and shifting consumer behavior, that dependence became a source of vulnerability. The factory's rise and eventual transformation illustrate how industrial success can generate stability in one era and uncertainty in another. This pattern would later repeat across multiple sectors of American manufacturing. The historical meaning of a tobacco factory is also shaped by hindsight. Products once viewed as ordinary became subjects of intense scrutiny as scientific understanding advanced. Looking back, it is tempting to impose modern judgments on earlier decisions. Yet the factory's operators worked within the norms and knowledge of their time. Understanding this context allows for a more accurate interpretation of the past, one that acknowledges consequences without distorting motivations. Today, the site stands as a reminder that industrial places are not static. They reflect the priorities, assumptions, and limits of the periods that created them. The R.J. Reynolds complex illustrates how American industry built enormous systems to meet demand, and how those systems eventually had to adapt when the world around them changed. Its legacy is not defined solely by what it produced, but by how it demonstrated the power and impermanence of industrial scale. The broader lesson is one of balance. Scale can create efficiency and opportunity, but it can also narrow options when circumstances shift. Strong brands can unify markets, but they can also anchor communities to a single economic identity. The history of this factory invites reflection. Rather than celebration or condemnation, it shows how industry can drive growth, shape culture, and leave lasting physical and economic footprints. In the end, the R.J. Reynolds factory occupies a complex place in American history. It represents ambition, organization, and influence, while also illustrating the challenges of change in a modern economy. To understand it fully is not to praise or dismiss it, but to recognize it as part of a larger story, one in which industry, society, and time are inseparably linked.